Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the second in our series of webinars focusing on biosimilars. Last time we considered the basics of the regulatory system for biosimilar products in Europe and the US. Today we will be looking at the way in which biosimilars are prescribed and how, within this framework, biosimilar manufacturers can access the market most effectively. In particular, we were looking at interchangeability of biosimilars in the minds of healthcare professionals and possible substitution in the pharmacy, as well as looking at advertising of biosimilars. These topics are regulated nationally, and so we have a number of experts from different jurisdictions to guide us through the issues over the next hour. My name is Matthew Royal, and I am joined by Heather Schneider and Mike Johnson from Wilkie Farr and Gallagher, and by my Taylor Wessing colleagues, Manja Epping from Germany, Evelyn Friedel from France, Wim Maas from the Netherlands, and Tim Worden from the UK. To begin with, I'll hand over to Heather to tell us more about interchangeable biosimilars in the US.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, we thought that we would start by having a discussion of interchangeability and substitution in the United States. And in the United States, the word interchangeability has a very specific meaning under the statute, the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act we talked about last week. So basically, companies can make a biosimilar, as you're all familiar with, but they can also choose to show that that particular biosimilar is interchangeable with the reference product. And under the BPCIA, a biologic may be designated interchangeable if the product is biosimilar, the product is expected to produce the same clinical result as the reference product in any given patient, and it is safe for a patient to switch between the reference product and biosimilar. So all interchangeable drugs are biosimilars, but not all biosimilars have to be designated interchangeable. In fact, interchangeability may be difficult and costly to demonstrate. It's generally thought that the FDA is going to require at least switching clinical studies where you actually switch patients between the reference product and the biosimilar. And so far in the United States, no biosimilar has been approved as interchangeable. So you might ask what types of benefits might come from having this designation. Well, the first interchangeable biosimilar would receive 1 year of exclusivity over subsequent interchangeable biosimilars. So if interchangeability starts catching on and companies start designating products as interchangeable biosimilars to get some benefits, then you might get a benefit from that 1 year of exclusivity. The real issue will be whether designating drugs as interchangeable will help the substitution at the pharmacy that Matt alluded to. Pharmacies may be free to substitute interchangeable biosimilars for the reference product without a prescribing physician's consent. In the United States, the role of substituting drugs at the pharmacy is often or typically governed by state law. And right now there are 45 out of 50 states and Puerto Rico that have laws governing the substitution of biosimilars by pharmacists. So on the next slide, we show a couple of just the typical state law features. The first is that many states would require for there to be sort of substitution or automatic substitution that the biosimilar must be approved as interchangeable. Many of the state laws allow the prescriber to opt out. For example, the prescribing doctor could prevent substitution by a biosimilar. Some of the state laws require prescriber notification that if the pharmacy is going to swap out for an interchangeable drug, they have to notify the doctor. Some even require notifying the patient, telling the patient that a substitution of the drug has been made. Many of the state laws require detailed records to be kept of whatever biologics are substituted for a reference product. And many times they require that the substituted product have the lowest cost. So those can all be hurdles to biosimilar adoption in the United States. Now, another issue that's come up in the United States that can relate to substitution is, and I'm gonna flip ahead to slide 6. I think the slides might have been moving by themselves there. Now I've moved to the slide on non-proprietary naming policies. So as in the United States, there has been a big discussion after the BPCIA was enacted about how generic, basically biosimilar drugs should be named. And by non-proprietary name, we basically mean the generic drug name. And basically what the FDA finally decided is that they're going to have a designation for the originator product, biosimilar products, and that's going to be a combination of a core name and a suffix with 4 letters. And they're still trying to develop guidance on what these suffixes will be for interchangeable products. Now the benefit of this is that having these different names and suffixes supposedly would help aid people in tracking drugs that are used, so you can track adverse events, identify the right products for billing purposes, and prevent accidental or inadvertent substitution. The concern from many biosimilar manufacturers when the naming policies are being discussed is that this is going to be used as a way to keep physicians and patients from substituting biosimilar drugs. It will make patients think the drugs are different when they're, in a way that's unacceptable. So just to help make this more concrete, because it's a little abstract talking about these names and suffixes, many of you are familiar with small molecule drugs. So for example, you might have the brand names of Advil, here in the United States, Equate, Well at Walgreens. These are all sort of U.S. pharmacy names for ibuprofen, but they're all called ibuprofen in the generic sense. On the biologic side, we will end up having drugs with names like infliximab and biosimilars, and eventually reference products will have a suffix. And the biosimilars will have different suffixes, like infliximab DYYB or ABDA. And this is a policy that we're still seeing enacted in the United States. Now I'm going to move ahead so that our colleagues at Taylor Wessing can discuss other countries.
Thank you very much, Heather. So, a few words on the possible substitution of a biological product with a biosimilar in France. As a principle, the substitution is possible only with the previous and express consent of the physician. That said, and as a derogation, the substitution of a biological product with a biosimilar is possible under the following conditions. First, the biosimilar belongs to the same group. The physician has not excluded the possibility of the substitution. The substitution can be implemented at the start of the treatment or to allow the continuity of a treatment initiated with the same biosimilar. And the reimbursement cannot be higher than the most expensive biosimilar of the group. So, few other conditions concerning information for the substitution. Of course, the pharmacist must inform the physician of the substitution and must indicate on the medical prescription the name of the biosimilar delivered. But also, the physician and the pharmacist must, of course, also inform the patient. And in this respect, it must be noted that the decree, the administrative decree, which must still specify the implementing provisions of these conditions, has not been adopted yet. Now, again, for information, I would add that the French Drug Agency publishes the list of the biosimilars which are available on the French market. And you will note that information on these biosimilars are accessible on the French agency website, and this list actually differs from the EU list. And why? This is because of the reimbursement process not necessarily achieved for all of them yet. Now we will see with Manja what is the situation in Germany.
Thank you, Evelyn. In Germany, the general rule for generic substitution at pharmacy level is that if the doctor prescribes a product under its brand name, the pharmacist must substitute if no rebate agreement is in place for the product and if the product does not belong to the 3 cheapest products with the same API, the same strength, and a similar dosage form. Substitution is mandatory for small molecule products unless the doctor has excluded substitution by crossing out the out idem field on the prescription. For biosimilars, the legal situation is different. Substitution is only allowed if the prescribed product and the biosimilar are identical in terms of starting materials and manufacturing process. This means that they must be bioidenticals. The second condition for substitution is that the products considered as bioidenticals must be listed in the table you can see on the right, which is part of the framework agreement between the head organization of the statutory health insurance in Germany and the German Pharmacists Association on the dispensing of medicinal products. The table, as you can see, was updated for the last time end of May 2016 and does therefore not take into account the more recently authorized biosimilars. As an example, you can see at the lower end of the table that the infliximab biosimilars Inflectra and Remsima are considered as interchangeable. There's no substitution between originator products and biosimilars at pharmacy level because the manufacturing process is typically not identical. I would like to add that it's also permissible in Germany to prescribe a product under its INN, so the non-proprietary name. In the case of biologics, some say that a prescription under INN is unclear and pharmacists must contact the doctor before handing over a biosimilar to the patient. I'm now handing over to Wim, who will present the situation in the Netherlands.
Thank you very much, Manja. In the Netherlands, there is no specific legislation on substitution of medicinal products, including biosimilars. Doctors in principle prescribe medicinal products by their international non-proprietary name. However, the general consensus in the Netherlands is that biologicals and biosimilars are prescribed by brand name to allow for an adequate clinical monitoring. If a brand name is indeed prescribed, the pharmacy can only substitute the product if the prescriber and the patient give permission. And reimbursement issues may be a reason why a pharmacy may suggest another product. The Royal Dutch Society for the Advancement of Pharmacy issued a guidance note on substitution already in 2013. And in respect of the substitution between innovator product and a biosimilar and substitution between biosimilars, it is specifically noted that there are no scientific grounds against substitution if the biological is prescribed for the first time, of course subject to approval by prescriber and patient, but substitution for an indication or administration route for which a biosimilar has not been authorized is discouraged. I'm going to the next slide. A similar guidance on interchangeability of biological is given by the Dutch Medicines Evaluation Board. I'm quoting, the exchange between biological medicines, regardless of whether they are innovative products or biosimilar medicines, is permitted, but only if adequate clinical monitoring is performed and the patient is properly informed. The MEB further notes that new patients can be treated with a biosimilar straight away, so no need to first start with the innovator product. But uncontrolled exchange between biologicals must be avoided, and a patient must receive adequate instruction and must be adequately monitored. If a patient is treated with a biological, detailed product and batch information must be recorded in the patient file, so to ensure that the product can be traced in the event of problems. The MEB position relates to a switch between the reference medicines and the biosimilar medicines based on that reference medicine, or switching between biosimilars based on the same reference medicines. I'm now handing over to Matt.
Thanks, Wim. So the position in the UK is reflected in these quotes from the MHRA, that it is good practice to use the brand name when prescribing biosimilars, and NICE, the body in the UK responsible for public health, that it should be ensured that biosimilars are prescribed by brand name. Of course, if prescribed by brand, as in the other countries, the pharmacist has no option to substitute another product. The rationale for this, as has been explained, is to put clinical decisions in the hands of the healthcare professional. Now, if the decision is put in the hands of the healthcare professional, then they are able to respond to developing information as clinical experience is gathered with each biosimilar. It is useful to use infliximab as an example to demonstrate this. In that case, based on the clinical evidence, NICE adopted guidance that when prescribing infliximab, doctors should start with the least expensive treatment, which typically would be the biosimilar. Now, the evidence that produced this recommendation included studies such as the NOR-switch study, which showed that switching from a reference biologic to the biosimilar and back again was not inferior to remaining on the reference biologic throughout treatment. The upshot of the need in each jurisdiction for healthcare professionals to prescribe by brand and to make the clinical decisions is that biosimilar manufacturers will need to engage with healthcare professionals to convince them to prescribe their product rather than the reference biological product. This means, of course, advertising, which is something that may be unfamiliar to some biosimilar manufacturers. And given that the rules differ across jurisdictions, we'll now switch to an overview of the position on advertising, starting with the US, and I will hand over to Mike.
Thank you, Matt. Switching gears a little bit, we want to talk a little bit about the idea of advertising and how labeling and advertising are regulated across the different jurisdictions, starting with the United States. In the United States, regulation of prescription drug labeling and advertising has been given by federal statute to the FDA. Part of what the FDA does is to monitor and regulate the labeling and advertising, and we'll go into the differences between what constitutes labeling and what constitutes advertising. Generally, the FDA is divided up into centers, and the centers are responsible both for drug approval but also for the regulation of the labeling and advertising for the drugs which they are responsible for approving. Now, the Federal Trade Commission in the United States, which generally has authority over unfair trade practices, which you can imagine a violation of advertising could also fall under that, they actually do have some overlapping jurisdiction under Section 5 of the FTC Act. But the way that in practice that this is divided up is that the FTC really takes jurisdiction over over-the-counter medicines as well as certain medical devices, for example, stents. And the FDA is responsible primarily for prescription drug medication. And at this time, which is about the halfway portion of the webinar, we just want to read the CLE code, which you'll need to note in order to get CLE credit for any of the attendees who would like it. It's WF, the ampersand, and G1313. So if you could just note that, and if anyone is interested in obtaining CLE, they'll need this code. And again, the code is WF ampersand G1313. And if you have any questions about obtaining CLE credit, you can contact Heather or I at Wilkie Farr. Moving along a little bit, I mentioned that there are these centers within the FDA, and the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, CDER, as it's sometimes called, has responsibility for approving and monitoring most of what so far we've seen in the biosimilar world. These are antibodies, for example, fall under CDER's domain. Therapeutic proteins like EPO and Neulasta, Neupogen, they all fall under the purview of CDER, which I found a little bit interesting because it's the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. There's a separate center in the FDA, if we get the next slide, CBER, which is the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. And for whatever, a while back when these two centers were essentially divided out, and strangely enough, the Biologics Center doesn't have regulation over antibodies and other therapeutic proteins. They're more responsible for vaccines, blood products, gene therapy products. And it was the gene therapy products that sort of caught our attention in that, we're seeing a lot of that as being very interesting in terms of new product development. So eventually, it would be interesting to start to see if we see biosimilars of those as well. So although CBER doesn't have much of a role in biosimilars now, we suspect that it might take on greater importance in the future. So what does it mean? What is labeling? So there's a clear definition in the statute. Labeling is defined as all labels and other written, oriented, or graphic material upon any article or its container or wrappers and any accompanying items. Seems straightforward, but the FDA has interpreted this very, very broadly. Under the FDA's view, basically anything that a drug product manufacturer provides to a healthcare professional in any manner is deemed to accompany such article and thus falls under the definition of labeling. This includes things like brochures that are targeted to healthcare professionals, detailing pieces, and even price lists can fall under the definition of labeling. Advertisements is really more focused on primarily stuff that's intended to go direct to consumer. Magazines, journals, periodicals, newspapers, that types of thing. But the interesting thing, whether you think about whether or not something's labeling or advertising, it really doesn't make much of a difference. The FDA regulates these in the same way. And the key standard here is that labeling and advertising has to be, quote, truthful and non-misleading. When you get into advertisement, there's also, and the idea with labeling is that you're going to provide more of the information about the drug in labeling from what we would normally think of the product label, the approved indication and that, because it's directed towards healthcare professionals. The advertising is something where you would see more likely a summary of what they've been approved for. The people in the United States are probably familiar with television advertising of prescription drugs. I'm not sure that's as common in the rest of the world as it is in the United States. But there, it's summary of sort of the risks and benefits associated with the drug. So there's elements of fair balance that needs to come into that. And with basically the other interesting thing about the regulation of labeling and advertising in the United States is you don't need it to be pre-approved most of the time, with rare exception. Like for the launch of a new product, that material generally gets pre-approved. But the rest of it is after the fact. After you run the advertisement or the newspaper, you have to submit it to the FDA. And the FDA review and regulation of this is sort of after the fact, after it's already been distributed. So we wanted to look a little bit at what the FDA has been doing on this front, keeping in mind the truthful and non-misleading standard. As Heather alluded to in the first biosimilars webinar, if anybody is on that, the FDA has put forth a biosimilar action plan, This was a big step by the FDA because it talks not only about how they're going to work to facilitate the review and approval of biosimilars, but how the FDA actually sees it as part of their responsibility to drive uptake and public awareness of biosimilars. And to affect that, there are 4 main areas of focus for the biosimilar program. The first one is that idea that you would think of from the FDA, improving the efficiency of the review and approval product for both biosimilars and interchangeables. But really, the next 3 are all more market-type factors. Maximizing scientific and regulatory clarity for the biosimilar product development community, developing effective communications to improve the understanding, not only among patients, clinicians, and the last one is really a key driver in the United States, the payers, the insurance, the reimbursement systems, because so much of the medicine prescription is driven by the payer and reimbursement structure. And then supporting market competition by reducing gaming of the requirements. And we're starting to see some developments in this area. Obviously, the biosimilars in the United States is a much more emerging field than in Europe, where there's more marketing experience over a longer time. But the key thing that we're starting to see is this idea of truthful and non-misleading. And the FDA has said in multiple contexts that just because something's true doesn't mean you can say it. There's actually, decisions on advertising that says, well, this is true, but it's still misleading. And I think that's some of the areas that we're going to see explored, particularly in the biosimilar area. If we have the next slide. The first interesting development is that Pfizer has filed a citizens petition with the FDA. They filed it on August 22nd of this year. A citizens petition is basically a request by a private individual or corporation for the FDA to do something or take some action. And here, what Pfizer is requesting is that the FDA issue guidance to ensure truthful and non-misleading communication by the reference product sponsors about biosimilars. And they're in the citizens petition, which is an interesting read. Pfizer points out that they've observed some reference product sponsors created physician and patient-directed material that mischaracterizes important elements of the biosimilar criteria, and they say are designed to basically disparage or cast doubts about the safety and efficacy of the biosimilar product. Again, hoping to prevent uptake by calling into question this. And some of the things that they pointed to in their letter is a reference product sponsor emphasizing that something is not interchangeable. While that statement may be true, if the point of the advertising is to suggest that you should be uncomfortable using the biosimilar, the FDA may have authority to say, yeah, that's true, but it's actually misleading. There's been other references to the reference product saying stuff is similar. Biosimilars are similar, whereas the standard in the FDA is actually highly similar. And so again, Pfizer points out that some of these advertisements to consumers or communications to healthcare professionals may be true, but could also be misleading, and that the FDA should take an active role in cracking down on that in order to foster market access and penetration among biosimilars. And so that's basically what we've seen on the FDA front. And I know I started off by saying that promotion and advertising is regulated primarily by the FDA in the prescription drug field. But with every rule, there are also exceptions. And so we want to point out one other recent development. I think it was just last week. The state of California brought suit. I think it was actually their Department of Insurance, the commissioner of the Department of Insurance for the state of California brought suit against AbbVie based on the marketing of its Humira product. I'm sure everyone who's joined this call is aware of the large volume of sales generated by Humira. And basically, the complaint alleges that AbbVie has engaged in an illegal scheme of kickbacks to healthcare providers in order to keep patients on Humira. There's some interesting factual allegations in this, that AbbVie's engaged in a far-reaching scheme, including both classic kickback, cash, meals, drinks, gifts, patient referrals, but also more specific ones, free and valuable professional goods, services. One of the big things in here is there's apparently an AbbVie ambassador program where AbbVie pays nurses to go around to doctor's office under the guise that they're helping the physicians do their job, when in fact they're paid for by AbbVie to encourage the use of Humira sales. So again, this is something, it's advertising in some respects, but here it's more of a competition thing where California is alleging injury due to the fact that they contend that the state of California has paid $1 billion more in paying insurance and reimbursements than they should have but for this illegal conduct by AbbVie. So even though promotional labeling and advertising is regulated by the FDA, there may be other ways that states or the federal government take action to discourage abuses and encourage access by biosimilars. Now, this isn't directly a biosimilar issue, but it is an interesting thing that will, I think a lot of people will be keeping their eyes on to see how that develops. So that's basically the end of the promotional and labeling for the United States. So I will turn it over to our friends at Taylor Wessing to address the European situation.
Thank you very much. I will address the Dutch situation first. Click to the next slide. Advertising of medicinal products, including biosimilars and including advertising by inducement, is in the Netherlands regulated by two complementary systems: statutory rules and a system of self-regulation. The statutory rules are laid down in the Medicines Act and regulations and policy rules based on that act. The act is enforced by the healthcare inspector authority, and non-compliance can be sanctioned with an administrative fine of up to €450,000. If a fine has been imposed twice for the same behavior within 24 months, there are criminal sanctions, and the maximum criminal sanction is 6 months in prison. The system of self-regulation is based on codes of conduct drawn up by organizations with the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry. Relevant for biosimilar is the Code of Conduct for Pharmaceutical Advertising. That code is supervised by the Code Committee of the Foundation for the Code of Pharmaceutical Advertising. Complaints can be filed with that Code Committee, whereby complaint proceedings are most always between competitors. One can also ask the Code Committee for an advice on intended advertising activities. Non-compliance with the code can result in an injunction and a rectification. No penalties will be attached to such sanctions, and no fines are applied by the Code Committee. Go to the next slide. Some rules on advertising as laid down in the Medicine Act and in the code are that information in advertising material should not be in conflict with information in the SMPC. That the advertising should not be misleading, and this means that one should avoid vague terms and superlatives to exaggerate properties of the advertised product, and the information in the advertisement must be, of course, accurate, up-to-date, and truthful, and that claims relating to the advertised product must be verifiable, so that's a difficult word for me, meaning that such claim should be supported in the approved SMPC or in one or more scientific publications in a peer-reviewed journal. There are specific rules for comparative claims in medicine advertisements. For example, such claims must be substantiated by at least one directly comparative head-to-head scientific study, which is published in a peer-reviewed journal and which is of sufficient quality and authority. The comparative advertisement must again not be misleading, and the comparative advertisement must not discredit the competitor and its trade name or trademark. I'm handing over now to Evelyn in France.
Thank you, Wim. So, as for France, the general requirements for advertising biosimilars are actually the same as those applicable to ordinary drugs. But it must be noted that the French regulation in this matter differs from the EU rules, since it is stricter for several years now. Indeed, as a rule, any advertising must receive a prior authorization from the French Drug Agency, the ANSM, indeed if the advertising is only targeted at professionals. So any information also about a drug, any information with just a commercial intent constitutes a promotion and an advertising. So of course, the advertising of a drug must comply with the principles just presented by Wim, must not endanger public health, must be truthful and objective, and strictly comply with the marketing authorization. The next slide refers actually to advertising towards professionals and consumers. But regarding biosimilars, promotion towards professionals is the most relevant. And as said, even when the promotion is only targeted at professionals, it needs this prior authorization, which is the difference with the EU general rules. So as a practical matter also, specific provisions and recommendations enacted by the French Drug Agency govern the advertising of prescription-only drugs. And these recommendations concern the following subject matters. They are quite detailed, so it was not the purpose of this presentation to enter into these details, but some recommendations concern safety data when it is used in advertisement, the improvement of the medical service rendered by the drug, so the way the advertisement refers to the improvement of the drug. Of course, recommendations also concern regulate the materials which are used for the advertising. So we have recommendations per type of materials. We have recommendations on comparative advertisement, and we also have recommendations on generics, which might be also a guideline for biosimilars. So now we'll see with Tim what is the situation in the UK.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. So in the UK, the regulation of advertising and promotion is based on a code of practice which is policed by the PMCPA, which stands for the Prescription Medicines Code of Practice Authority, which is part of the industry body in the UK, the AbbVie. This code has been in place for more than 50 years now and is the cornerstone of self-regulation in the pharmaceutical industry when it comes to the promotion of prescription-only medicines. It effectively enshrines both European and UK law, and in fact goes further than it in some respects. all members of the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, or the ABPI, are obliged to comply with the code as a condition of their membership and subject to the jurisdiction of the PMCPA. If you are not a member of the ABPI, and many generic pharmaceutical companies are not, as it has historically been more of an organization, the members of which are brand companies, you may select to submit to the jurisdiction of the PMCPA and the code without being a member of the ABPI. And most pharmaceutical companies in the UK are either members of the ABPI or voluntarily submit to the jurisdiction under the code. If you don't do that, you are subject to direct regulation by the MHRA, being the UK medicines regulator. So the code operates on the basis that an individual or a company may make a complaint that the practices, the promotional practices of another company are in breach of the code, and then a process is triggered whereby evidence is effectively exchanged, and the PMCPA will make a ruling on whether or not certain promotional materials are in breach of the UK Code of Practice. There is a right of appeal up to the appeal board, but ultimately if you are found to be in breach of the code, you are subject to a fine and possible other sanctions, including a public reprimand or an audit of your procedures in-house for authorizing and reviewing promotional materials that are used by your sales representatives. The code itself contains a large number of provisions, a few of which we've summarized here, and many of them are similar to what you might see in other European jurisdictions. Any claims that are made, any information that is included, and importantly any comparisons that are made, must be accurate, balanced, fair, objective, and unambiguous. They must not be misleading, whether by implication, distortion, exaggeration, or undue emphasis, and they must be capable of substantiation with good quality data from clinical trials. Any claim that is made in a promotional material must be substantiated if a third party requests substantiation from the pharmaceutical company making the claim. You cannot use the term new if a product has been on the UK market for more than 12 months. It's also important to note that new products, including biosimilars, will be subject to what's known as pre-vetting in the first 6 months after their launch. It's during that period that the promotional materials for those products have to be reviewed by the MHRA before they are put into use. This is a separate process from the ABPI code jurisdiction, and importantly, even if a material has been accepted and signed off by the MHRA, that does not mean that it cannot be in breach of the Code of Practice under the PMCPA's jurisdiction. There are a number of watch-outs that we've listed there for the promotion of biosimilars in the UK, particularly claims around safety, efficacy and quality, and whether they are equivalent or comparable, and the way in which that's expressed. It's very important to ensure there is adequate data to back up any claims that are made, and that claims made are statistically significant if you are claiming any sort of superiority or inferiority of a biosimilar drug. All materials have to be certified under proper processes before they are used to promote the product, and any representatives who are in the field promoting the product also have to be fully trained on the code's requirements. Real care is required in relation to any meetings that take place with healthcare professionals, hospitality that is provided at those meetings, which must be very much secondary to the purpose of the meeting, and there is, pursuant to the FPA disclosure code, a European disclosure code, a requirement to disclose payments that are made to healthcare professionals in relation to consultancy and other arrangements. So I will finish the discussion of the UK position by looking at one recent case, which has been published by the PMCPA, who publish all of their case reports on their website. This related to a promotional email that was sent by a representative, and it included the text which you can see in the slide. The first point is that it said, "Your colleagues from across the UK are switching from the innovator product to the biosimilar and reinvesting their savings to improve patient care." The panel of the PMCPA found that the claim implied that every organisation that switched had savings to reinvest, and in fact the claim was only based on a small number of case studies and so could not be substantiated and therefore breached the code. It was found to be unequivocal, exaggerated and thereby misleading, and as you can see there, it breached 2 of the clauses within the code. Secondly, it included the phrase, "Don't get left behind, make the switch." The claim was ruled to imply that if a reader did not switch, they and their clinical practice were in some ways outdated. This was found to breach a separate provision of the code, clause 9.2, as the claim did not recognise the professional standing of the audience and their ability to make their own decisions, and was likely to cause offence. So that was one of the more recent cases on biosimilars that we've had in the UK under the PMCPA's code. There are expected to be more in due course as the promotion of biosimilars becomes more common in the UK. And with that, I pass on to Manja, who will give us an overview of the position in Germany.
Thanks very much, Tim. I go forward. In Germany, advertising and promotion of medicinal products is governed by specific legislation for health products and treatments, the so-called Medical Advertising Act, or in German Heilmittelwerbegesetz, and the general provisions in the Act Against Unfair Competition. Both acts prohibit, for example, misleading advertising. Infringements of the Medical Advertising Act constitute a criminal offence in case of intentionally misleading advertising and an administrative offence in all other cases, with possible fines up to 50,000 euros. In most cases, however, infringements of the Medical Advertising Act are brought before the civil courts by competitors and industry associations because these infringements are at the same time considered acts of unfair competition. The most important consequence is that advertising campaigns can be stopped within a few days by way of preliminary injunctions. In the case of advertising campaigns rolled out in the whole country, competitors can choose between various competent courts. Some of them have therefore developed special expertise in pharmaceutical matters, for example, the courts in Hamburg. According to consistent practice of the courts in unfair competition matters, health-related advertising has to meet strict standards in terms of correctness, non-ambiguity and clarity. A claim is considered misleading if it is false or if it is not sufficiently scientifically proven. Scientific evidence must usually meet the so-called gold standard and include at least one published, randomized, placebo-controlled, double-blind clinical trial which is subject to an adequate statistical evaluation. The scientific proof must already exist at the time the advertising claim is made. If the court has reason to believe that the claim is not sufficiently founded, the burden of proof will be shifted to the defendant. If the advertising claim is based on a study, any limitations or provisos resulting from the study must be made transparent. However, if the claim is included in the marketing authorization, it is deemed to meet the required scientific standard at the time the marketing authorization was granted. Therefore, it is up to the competitor to prove any changes to the scientific standard. In a quite recent judgment of the Higher Regional Court of Hamburg, the claim efficacy and safety comparable to reference product was used for advertising a filgrastim biosimilar with reference to a published clinical study. The study was a clinical pharmacological study in healthy volunteers had been sufficient to obtain marketing authorization for the biosimilar in accordance with the guidelines of the EMA. According to the public assessment report, the biosimilar is comparable to the reference product in terms of quality, safety, and efficacy profiles. The advertising claim was nevertheless held to be misleading because, from a medical expert's perspective, the statement suggests that a head-to-head comparison of efficacy had been performed between the biosimilar and the reference product, which was not the case. The court found that the comparability claim was not part of the marketing authorization and could therefore not be justified by the marketing authorization. This last slide for Germany summarizes some key points to consider from a biosimilar company's perspective. Comparability claims may require additional scientific evidence. The studies required by the EMA guidelines might not be sufficient. Launching advertising campaigns requires careful preparation, especially due to the risk of preliminary injunctions. In some cases, filing legal arguments with the courts in advance by so-called protective pleadings or Schutzschrift can be appropriate. And this is the end of the German section, and I'm handing back to Matt now.
Thank you, Manja. Well, and that concludes our webinar, and it remains for me to thank our speakers, Manja Epping, Evelyn Friedel, Wim Maas, Tim Worden, Heather Schneider, and Mike Johnson, and to remind you about our third and final webinar on the 10th of October, where we will be looking at pricing and reimbursement and the competitive landscape for biosimilars. For now, thank you very much for joining today's webinar, and could I ask you to hold on for a few moments to answer a short feedback form?
Thank you, everyone.